be corresponding to this 24 gram per liter sugar addition that will be fermented for the during the secondary fermentation. I hope I'm being clear, but that's a very important stage right there. So let's have now look at, since we've been preparing these wines for secondary fermentation, let's have a look at how we operate these guys. Secondary from alcoholic fermentation, we'll speak about the yeast starter and a bit about this mixture preparation. Okay, so the difficulty we're having with the secondary alcoholic fermentation is basically we want to transform a dry base wine into a sparkling wine with 6 bar of overpressure, measured at 10 Celsius. Sorry for the Celsius again. The secondary alcoholic fermentation is something very different from an alcoholic fermentation, and it's also different from a restart fermentation. All right, it's different from that because we already have alcohol. You have low pH, usually around 3. You have SO2, total SO2s, or in good conditions, you have such numbers. It might be possible you have a bit over that. And the thing is that it's not a restart because we're having a closed environment within which the CO2, the carbon dioxide concentration goes up to 12 grams per liter. And that's massive because you need to know that past this 3 bar of overpressure, the CO2 become toxic for the yeast themselves. The last thing, if you are working with a classic method with fermentation in bottle, you are also unable to steer the yeast and to put them back in suspension. So you really need to prepare these beasts, sorry about the word, but really properly to fight all these really tough conditions we're having. All right, so then secondary alcoholic fermentation, kinetic in the bottle, lasts approximately 45 days. That's all depending on how you've been preparing yeast and the temperature of fermentation as well. So as I told you, what's going to happen once you inoculate the yeast in your wine is that the yeast population is going to rise up until the CO2 concentration is too high. Then at about 3 bar, the multiplication stops. The CO2 becomes toxic for the yeast. And from 3 bar, you need to go to 6 bar with a live left population. So it means that your population at the beginning and the multiplication to this 3 bar needs to be super strong to be able to go to the end and to finish the second half of this secondary fermentation. All right. So, as I said before, the level of yeast population achieved in the bottle once the cellular growth stops is the key factor to manage the secondary alcoholic fermentation. So this population might vary according, of course, to the ferment ability of your wine. We're talking about yeast nutrition, about the starter. We're talking about your SO2, how high or low is your pH, etc. You know, all these things in which you need to really potentialize. One very important one, which you really can play a big role on, is the temperature. The temperature of the secondary fermentation. For some reason, there is a myth saying that you have better bubbles at low temperature. But this myth has never been demonstrated. So it's like it's totally, I would bust that myth because honestly, fermenting at 454 like you have here is not giving any finer bubbles than if you would be fermenting at 68 Fahrenheit. So that's totally not justified, I would say. What's happening though is that if your temperature is too low, you really reduce your multiplication. That means that even if you inoculate here, in this case, this was an experiment done by CIBC, they were inoculating each of these wines with 1.2 million cells, and the maximum population in the bottle at 54 is 7.5 million, where at 15, you see, we go at 10.5, and at 20, you go at 12.5. So what also you have kind of a plateau, all right, because inside the bottle, in this space, you cannot have 20, 25 million cells, even if you would go at 30 Celsius. That wouldn't go because there is simply not enough space in the bottle for this population. So past 12.5 to 14 million, that would be pretty much it, right? What is important though, is that at 3 bar, we have at least 9 million cells still alive and ready to fight. That's the reason why I advise to be in between 59 and 64 Fahrenheit, to not add to the difficult condition the temperature. That would be just not putting all chances on your side. Sorry. So, and what is also crucial in achieving this yeast population is the quality of the yeast starter. How you have been trained your yeast to resist to these conditions. And this is going to be totally crucial for the success of the secondary fermentation. What we are looking at is a very precise physiological state of the yeast once we will inoculate the tank. And we look at the population of yeast starter from 50 to 60 million cells inside the yeast starter to operate a dilution at least 3% of the volume to inoculate, which will lead to an inoculum between 1.5 and 2 million cells per milliliter. And we don't want to more either, because we don't want to have problem of riddling afterwards. Okay, we're going to look at this in details. There is also something very important, and that we really start all of us to focus on lately. This is the dissolved CO2 of your blend before inoculating. We have seen together that the CO2 at one stage is toxic for the yeast multiplication. So we need also to look at the dissolved CO2 into this base wine before starting. Meaning that if your dissolved CO2 is above 1,500 milligram per liter, it's necessary to take an action, meaning to degas your wine. If it's in between 1,000 and 1,500, I will still recommend, because what we're targeting to be on the safe zone, let's say it's to be below 1,000 milligram per liter of dissolved CO2 before starting the secondary fermentation. So it's also kind of good to monitor that before starting things. It's always one thing more to put all chances on your side. There was a big questioning around the nutrition and the capacity of the strain to make the secondary fermentation. So we have been financing with LAFFORT a thesis of Maria Martiraga. So there was a Spanish student. So that's a thesis she was doing in collaboration with the University of Bordeaux and the University of Tarragona in Spain, and us, of course, and LAFFORT, who was financing this job with Philippe Mario, which is our yeast guru in LAFFORT. So the subject was to find, basically, they wanted to understand the genetic factors, so the QTLs of interest that define how a yeast is able or has the capacity to do safe secondary fermentation. So they wanted to find basically genetic markers into these yeasts, which we know to be resistant, to find genetic markers to say, hey, this is a candidate for secondary fermentation, and genetically it has this portion of genomes, which lets us know, yeah, this is a marker. And when we select a yeast today, we look if the yeast has this marker, and to see if we were going to propose it for the secondary fermentation or not. All right. But what was interesting during this thesis, this PhD work, beside the genetic aspect of it, which I'm not going to review today, it was that she has also tried to identify the nitrogen requirement of Saccharomyces cerevisiae during the secondary fermentation. And believe me or not, before this thesis, this hasn't been done. And then she also tried in the same job, it was a really good thesis job here, she's tried to characterize the effect of different nitrogen addition in the final sparkling wine composition. So basically, we're trying to know the impact of nitrogen modulation during the secondary fermentation, during the preparation of the starter, and during the secondary fermentation. Let's have a look at the job. I've tried just to synthesize the essence of this thesis because it's really a dense one. Okay, the questions you wanted to answer to start with: what does the quality of nitrogen source, so meaning mineral versus organic, does this quality of nitrogen source inside the pied de cuve, so meaning inside the yeast starter, influences the secondary fermentation? Question one. Second, so for this question two, what is the impact of the addition of nitrogen in the base wine, okay, for the secondary fermentation? Then she also answered sideways the influence of the fermentation temperature and the influence, of course, of the yeast strain, because as you remember, the aim of this job was to find genetical markers for the resistance of secondary fermentation. So the setup she's been doing for that is pretty dense, but you will see she's screening 3 different yeast strains, okay, which are here. On these 3 yeast strains, she has been preparing yeast starter, which we call pied de cuve. She has been doing them, and there are 2 different nitrogen addition, one organic and one mineral. So then she's been adding that to the tirage to 3 different base wines, okay? And in this base wine, each of these 3 base wine, some of them without nitrogen and some of them with nitrogen at 30 milligrams per liter. And because it was not complicated enough, she was monitoring all this at 12 and 16 Celsius for the secondary fermentation. And she's been using this tool here, which is a tool which under infrared measure the CO2 concentration, so meaning the CO2 intake into the bowl, all right? So here is the synthesis of all this analysis all together. We try to mix that. So she's measuring a fermentative rate, which with this technique, non-invasive, as you can see, with the number of bar per day that a secondary fermentation is achieving. So let's have a look closer into this. Temperature. What's the impact of temperature on fermentation rate? Basically at 12 and at 16, there is a big difference, okay? At 16, the yeast feels much happier, so your fermentation speed is faster. Now there is, of course, a very important of the yeast strain used, because under the same conditions, as you can see, some strains don't have the same capacity to go to the end, right? At least in terms of kinetics. Now, the importance of the nitrogen source in the yeast starter. Here we feel also quite a good difference between the organic nutrition in the yeast starter, so 100% organic, versus a mineral one. So meaning that apparently, and we look at it a bit closer, the organic nutrition in the starter is more efficient. And the last one that we are looking at is the influence of nitrogen addition in the base wine, all right, at this stage. And here the difference was not so big, all right, because in between the one without or with DAP addition, it was not so high. Let's go closer to look at this last assumption regarding the difference of YAN level in the base wine before starting secondary fermentation. So we have here a second set of experimentation where you have 0 nitrogen, 17.64 milligrams per liter of YAN, 30 milligrams per liter, and 47.64. And if you look at that, is that first of all, even on the strain which is the least performing one, if you remember this ARM, basically without any YAN, The red one, fermentation finishes. Okay, we reach 6 bar. Takes some time. It takes some time to get there, but we reach it. The end of the pressure is the same, as we can see here, whatever the yan added. That's also something to look at. What is changing though, is that the time to build the pressure can be very different. Understand that if you have, in this case here, the 30 milligram nitrogen seems to be, in this case, sorry, I can't really take this curve, a bit faster even than the 47. Now, this was a bit intriguing us, and she's been looking at the pressure at different concentration of nitrogen. So she has set up a new set of fermentation, and she's looked for each of these dots here are these 3 different strains we've been screening before. And she sees that if she gives without the pressure in bar after 15 days, okay, that's about half of the fermentation, is lower without nitrogen is there, and it rises up until 30 milligram of nitrogen in the base one. After that, basically, we have a phenomenon of plateau. That means basically as a conclusion that we don't really need more than 30 milligram per liter of yan in the base wine for an efficient prise de mousse. What is the also at all the conclusion we can get from this job is that in the pied cuve, so in the starter, the quality of the nitrogen source can significantly impact the fermentation rate. So what we have observed is if we have a slower growth rate in the preparation of the yeast starter, and the more efficient is going to be the secondary fermentation. It would be like if my yeast buildup is slower, my yeast will be more robust to the conditions and to the secondary fermentation. Okay. Now the other these features are still strain dependent. I mean, let's be also very honest with that. Second observation with the base wine now is that the nitrogen uptake during the pied cuve is enough, basically. What you have given here, it's enough to achieve secondary fermentation. However, we consider that 30 milligram per liter is the limit under which we don't want to be. All right. Talking about yeasts, with LAFFORT, this is our proposal for yeasts. So the very classic one, champagne style, is Zymerflor Spark. So Zymerflor Spark, for you to know, this is one of the 4 yeasts which has been accredited from the CIVC for the champagne area, you know, together with IOC 18 2007 and DV10 and CHP. So that's for the 4 yeasts which are approved, and they are approved for their capacity of not being different. So they make 3 years of tests to prove that none of the taster can pick the difference. So we are really within a neutral yeast, strong, making ferment. That's where we are. Now, because of this job with the genetic characterization of the resistance to secondary fermentation, we found out, and we were happy about it, that X5 and X16 have a capacity to achieve secondary fermentation as well. And this is becoming interesting, especially in the world of Prosecco type, Charmat, because this is probably our best seller nowadays in Prosecco region to get these nice, lighty, fruity, vibrant wines. And X16, if you know, this strain is really one of our super lively aromatic yeast, which people are really keen with. Of course, we propose this yeast with the Superstart Spark, so which is a Superstart which is specifically enriched with ergosterol. The idea again is to bring to the yeast more growth factors and more resistance to the alcohol, and that's the content of ergosterol. So it's a specific preparation dedicated definitely for the secondary fermentation. All right, now how to prepare this yeast? So I'm showing you this on purpose. It's like what Prosecco does. Because also we have a lot of flying winemakers, and I always like to really, we all come with our bag from our origin on the back, but conditions are mostly different. What's happening in Prosecco is they do a very short starter, 12 hours before inoculation. They start to rehydrate their yeast with Superstart Spark. They like to mix X16 and Zymaflow Spark within the rate of 30 grams per hectoliter, so 300 ppm and 200 ppm, right? And what they're doing, they rehydrate that, and then they put that in water with concentrated must. 60% water, 40% concentrated must, and they leave that 12 hours at 25 Celsius, so that's pretty high in temperature. And the next day, they will inoculate the tank. The only thing you really need to understand here is the free SO2 is below 8, the temperature is at 18 Celsius, and very important, Prosecco, the base wine, is never above 10.5% of alcohol. That means that when secondary fermentation is finished, you will be at 11.5. So that's where this protocol is okay here. Also because once they put that in the tank, they leave the valve open until it reaches 10% of alcohol. So most of their must are below 10%. They put the yeast starter of 12 hours in the tank. They leave another multiplication in the tank. And once they reach 10% of alcohol in this tank, clack, they close the tank. And then they start the real secondary fermentation. So there is, in fact, a bit more than 12 hours. In between the time they do that and the time they close the valve, you can consider there is 2 days of preparation. Now, if your base wine is above 10% of alcohol, I recommend a long and just a long and nice, I would say, 3-4 days protocol. Let's have a look at this protocol. So basically, this is the classic champagne protocol, where for traditional method, we aim at having 3% of yeast starter. So if I have a tirage of 1,000 hectoliter or 100,000 liter, I will have 3,000 liter of yeast starter to prepare. I'm using only 10 grams per hectoliter of yeast, which one you use, and I will start the rehydration. So in this case, I will rehydrate for my tirage, which would be January 1st. I will start my program on the 27th of December afternoon, and I start my yeast preparation. The first stage is the rehydration. It lasts 20 minutes. This is Superstart or Dynastart, which you mix in the water at 35, 38 Celsius. And you mix your yeast inside, you mix vigorously. After these 20 minutes, you go to the acclimatization phase, all right? So this acclimatization phase lasts 6 to 12 hours, let's say overnight. And this is basically your rehydrated yeast, in which you add base wine and in which you add a bit of sugar, okay? You maintain that at 20 Celsius and you start measuring your specific gravity. What is extremely important is that your specific gravity will help you know your activity, your yeast activity, okay? Your drop of sugar help you know how much your yeast are happy. And these yeast are happy when you are losing when you are losing about 10 to 12 points of specific gravity per day. All right. So when it goes down to around 1010 of specific gravity, we will go to the next stage. What is important when you do this type of protocol is that your yeast are never dry. And what is the aim of the protocol is to drive the yeast from zero alcohol to slowly get accustomed to the 11% of alcohol, which is the level you're going to inoculate them into. Okay. So when this first acclimatization phase is done, we go to something a bit longer. It lasts approximately 1 day and a half to 2 days. It's really depending on your conditions of temperature. And this is called the first yeast multiplication. So once again, we're going to go with your 500 liter of yeast. We slowly add a bit of base wine to enrich slowly in alcohol, not too much, as you can see. We'll have approximately 25% more. Then we add sugar. We add a bit of water as well, to dilute a bit all this, to not have too high concentration too fast in alcohol. And we add a bit of nutrition as well. We measure the specific gravity. We lose 6 to 12 points of specific gravity per day. It means that everybody is happy. And once this specific gravity goes around 1005, back, we go to the second multiplication phase. Okay, and these ones last as well 1.5 to 2 days. Again, you start at this stage to lower down slightly your temperature. You target more 18 on the temperature control. And you end up with your, again, it's the same principle. You add base wine, you add sugar, you add water, basically. And you aim to get something, once this stage is finished, this medium is going to be almost the level of alcohol, if not, of the base wine you're going to inoculate the same day. Okay. Again, extremely important is that this is not dry. Okay, you need to keep it. So once you have that ready, the morning of the tirage, you will be already more confident. Your yeast will be in third generation, fully budding. So this is how they look like, with a good rate of, with more than 70% of alive population. So of course you need to check that into the microscope, do your counting, and make your dilution. If your yeast starter is in between 50 to 60 million cells per milliliter, you will end up within the range of 1.2 to 2 million cells per milliliter once you will have inoculate your tank. Okay, and this is really the target you look at. Okay, to be safe, not more, not less.